I was 29 years old when I learned that my father was not the man I thought he was. For my entire life, I had believed a story that had been carefully constructed, a narrative that had shaped every aspect of who I was and how I saw the world. My father, Marcus Brennan, had abandoned us when I was 3 years old. That was what my mother had told me, what my grandparents had confirmed, what every relative and family friend had reinforced throughout my childhood. He had walked out one night, leaving behind a wife and a toddler son, and he had never come back. He had never called, never written, never made any attempt to contact me. He was a ghost, a void, a name that was spoken only in whispers and only with bitterness. And I had grown up believing that I was the son of a man who didn't care enough to stay. The truth, when it finally came, arrived not as a gradual revelation, but as a sudden, devastating blow. It came in the form of a letter delivered by a lawyer I had never met, containing information that would dismantle everything I thought I knew about my family and my past. And it came on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when I was sitting in my office at the architectural firm where I worked, staring at blueprints for a building that suddenly seemed completely irrelevant to anything that mattered. The letter was from the Innocence Project, an organization I had heard of but never had any reason to think about. It explained, in formal, legal language that took me several readings to fully absorb, that my father had been wrongfully convicted of armed robbery and murder 26 years ago. He had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He had served 22 years before new evidence, DNA evidence that had not been available at the time of his trial, had proven his innocence. He had been released 4 years ago, exonerated, his record cleared, and he had been trying to find me ever since. I read the letter 4 times, sitting at my desk with the afternoon sun streaming through the window and the sounds of the city drifting up from the street below. The words blurred and swam before my eyes, refusing to resolve into a coherent narrative. My father was not a deadbeat who had abandoned his family. He was not a coward who had run away from his responsibilities. He was an innocent man who had been stolen from me by a broken system, a man who had spent more than 2 decades in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit. And my mother, my grandparents, everyone I had trusted to tell me the truth, had lied to me for my entire life. I called my mother that evening, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and confusion and desperate hope. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar, the voice that had comforted me through childhood illnesses and teenage heartbreaks and adult disappointments. "Michael," she said, "what a nice surprise. I wasn't expecting to hear from you today. Is everything okay?" "No," I said, and the word came out harsher than I intended. "Everything is not okay. I got a letter today. A letter from the Innocence Project. About Dad. About what really happened to him." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that I thought for a moment the call had dropped. Then I heard my mother exhale, a long, shaky breath that seemed to contain decades of suppressed emotion. "I was wondering when you would find out," she said quietly. "I knew this day would come. I've been dreading it for 26 years. Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to control it. "Why did you let me believe he abandoned us? Why did you let me grow up thinking my father didn't love me?" "Because I was trying to protect you," she said, and now I could hear tears in her voice, the kind of tears that come from a wound that has never fully healed. "I was young and scared and alone, and I didn't know what else to do. The police told me he was guilty. The jury convicted him. Everyone said he did it. And I had a 3-year-old son to raise, a son who needed stability and security, and a mother who wasn't falling apart. I thought if I told you the truth, if I told you your father was in prison, it would destroy you. I thought it would be better if you just thought he was gone." "Better for who?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Better for you? Because it wasn't better for me. I spent my whole life thinking I was the son of a man who didn't want me. Do you have any idea what that does to a person? Do you have any idea how many years of therapy I've been through, trying to understand why I wasn't good enough for my own father to stick around?" My mother was crying openly now, her sobs punctuating her words. "I'm sorry," she said over and over again. "I'm so sorry, Michael. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting you. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye, something I had never done to my mother in my entire life. I sat in my apartment, the letter from the Innocence Project still clutched in my hand, and I tried to process the enormity of what I had learned. My father was alive. He was out there, somewhere, a free man. He had been looking for me, and I had no idea who he was. The letter included contact information for my father, a phone number, and an address in a town about 4 hours away. I stared at those numbers for a long time, my mind racing through 1,000 different scenarios. What would I say to him? How do you introduce yourself to a father you haven't seen since you were 3 years old? How do you compress 26 years of lost time into a single conversation? In the end, I didn't call. I got in my car and I drove. For hours through the night, the highway stretching out before me like a ribbon of darkness, my mind too full of questions to even think about sleep. I arrived in the town just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The address from the letter was a small house on a quiet street, unremarkable in every way. White siding, a small porch, a mailbox with the number 47 on it. I parked my car at the curb and sat there for what felt like an eternity, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The door opened before I could knock. A man stepped out onto the porch, and I knew immediately, instinctively, that he was my father. He was older than I had imagined, his hair completely gray, his face lined and weathered in a way that spoke of years of hardship. But his eyes were my eyes, the same shade of brown, the same shape. And his hands, resting on the porch railing, were my hands, the same long fingers, the same prominent knuckles. I had spent my whole life wondering who I looked like, and now I knew. "Michael," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion, as if he had been crying or was about to. "I knew you would come. I've been waiting for this day for 26 years. I didn't know what to say. All the speeches I had rehearsed in my head during the long drive evaporated in the presence of this man, this stranger who was also my father. I just stood there, frozen, staring at him, trying to reconcile the reality of his existence with the narrative I had been told my entire life. "They told me you abandoned us," I finally managed to say. "Mom and Grandma and Grandpa. They all told me you left and never looked back." He flinched, the words hitting him like a physical blow. "I never abandoned you," he said, his voice fierce despite its roughness. "I never stopped loving you, not for a single moment. They took me away in handcuffs, Michael. They put me in a cell and threw away the key. I wrote to you, hundreds of letters. But your mother never responded, and eventually the letters started coming back unopened. I didn't know if you were getting them. I didn't know if you even knew I existed. The letters. I had never received a single letter. I had never known they existed. My mother must have intercepted them, must have hidden them, must have made the decision to keep my father's words from reaching me. The betrayal of that, the calculated, deliberate erasure of my father from my life, hit me with a force that made my knees buckle. I grabbed the porch railing to steady myself, my vision swimming. "I didn't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know any of this. They told me you were gone. They told me you didn't want me. I've spent my whole life believing I wasn't good enough for my own father to love me." My father took a step toward me, and then another, until he was close enough to touch. He reached out, his hand trembling, and placed it on my shoulder. The weight of it was solid and warm and real, the first physical contact I had received from my father in 26 years. "You were always good enough," he said, his voice breaking. "You were the only thing that kept me going in that place. The thought of you, the hope of seeing you again someday, it was the only reason I survived." I looked at my father, at the tears streaming down his weathered face, and I felt the wall I had built around myself begin to crumble. All the anger I had carried for so long, the anger at a man I thought had rejected me, was suddenly redirected. I was angry at my mother for lying to me. I was angry at the justice system that had stolen my father from me. I was angry at a world that had allowed an innocent man to rot in prison for 22 years. But I was not angry at my father. I could never be angry at my father. He was as much a victim as I was. "Can we start over?" I asked, my voice small and uncertain, the voice of a child who was still, despite everything, looking for his father's approval. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to have a father, but I want to try. My father's face crumpled, and he pulled me into an embrace that was fierce and desperate and full of 26 years of longing. "We can start over," he said, his voice muffled against my shoulder. "We can start right now. My name is Marcus Brennan. I'm your father, and I have never, ever stopped loving you." We sat on his porch for hours, watching the sun rise higher in the sky and talking in the halting, awkward way of two people who were strangers but desperately wanted not to be. He told me about the night he was arrested, the knock on the door that had shattered our family, the confusion and terror of being accused of a crime he hadn't committed. He told me about the trial, the incompetent defense attorney, the witnesses who lied, the prosecutor who twisted every piece of evidence to fit a narrative that was completely, utterly false. He told me about the verdict, the moment when the word guilty had echoed through the courtroom and his entire world had collapsed. And then he told me about prison. 22 years in a cell the size of a bathroom, surrounded by men who had actually done the things he was accused of. The violence, the fear, the soul-crushing monotony of days that stretched into weeks that stretched into years. The birthdays and Christmases and first days of school that he had missed, marking the passage of time only by the photographs of me that my grandmother had sent him until she died. The photographs he had taped to the wall of his cell and looked at every single night before he went to sleep. The photographs were the hardest part, he said, his voice distant and haunted. Your grandmother sent them for the first few years. Pictures of you on your first day of kindergarten, your first bike, your first baseball game. You looked so happy, so normal. And I was in a cage, missing all of it. After she died, the photographs stopped. I didn't know what you looked like anymore. I didn't know anything about your life. That was the worst part, not knowing. I told him about my life, about the childhood he had missed. I told him about my mother, who had remarried when I was 10 to a man named Richard who had tried, in his own way, to be a father to me. I told him about my step-siblings, about the house in the suburbs, about the schools I had attended and the friends I had made. I told him about my career as an architect, about the buildings I had designed, about the life I had built for myself out of the rubble of a childhood defined by absence. I became an architect because of you, I said, and the words surprised me even as I spoke them. I didn't know it at the time, but I think some part of me remembered. You were a carpenter before you were arrested. You built things with your hands. And I think some part of me wanted to be like you, even though I didn't know you. My father's eyes filled with tears again, and he reached out and took my hand. I built a crib for you, he said quietly, when your mother was pregnant. I spent weeks on it, carving the rails by hand, sanding every surface until it was smooth as silk. I wanted you to have something that I made with my own hands, something that would last. What happened to it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Your mother got rid of it, he said, and there was no bitterness in his voice, only a profound, exhausted sadness. After I was arrested, she got rid of everything that reminded her of me. The crib, the photographs, the letters. She was trying to erase me from her life, and from yours. I thought about my mother, the woman who had raised me, who had sacrificed so much to give me a good life. She had lied to me. She had kept my father from me. She had made a choice, 26 years ago, to pretend that he had never existed. And I understood, in a way I hadn't been able to when I first received the letter, why she had done it. She had been young and scared and alone. She had believed my father was guilty because everyone told her he was guilty, and she had thought that the kindest thing she could do for me was to let me grow up without the shame of having a father in prison. She had been wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. But she had done what she thought was best. I'm going to talk to her, I said. I'm going to tell her that I know the truth. I'm going to ask her why she never told me. But I'm not going to cut her out of my life. I can't. She's my mother, and despite everything, I still love her. I hope you can understand that. My father nodded slowly. I don't hate your mother, he said. I was angry at her for a long time. Angry that she didn't believe me. Angry that she kept you from me. Angry that she gave up on our marriage without a fight. But I let that anger go a long time ago. It was eating me alive, and I couldn't afford to let it consume me. I had to focus on surviving. I had to focus on getting out. And now that I'm out, all I want is to know my son. I don't want to spend whatever time I have left being angry at the past. The months that followed were a slow, careful process of rebuilding a relationship that had been stolen from us. I visited my father every weekend, driving the 4 hours each way without complaint, because every hour in the car was worth it for the hours I got to spend with him. We talked about everything and nothing, filling in the gaps of 26 years of separation. I learned that he loved old movies and bad jokes and the smell of freshly cut grass. He learned that I was allergic to shellfish and terrified of heights, and hopelessly in love with a woman named Julia who I had been dating for 3 years. I introduced him to Julia, and I watched as he shook her hand with the formal politeness of a man who had been raised in a different era. She was nervous, I could tell, but she was also kind, the kind of kindness that came naturally to her. "It's so nice to finally meet you," she said, her voice warm. "Michael has told me so much about you. He's been waiting his whole life to find you." My father looked at me, his eyes glistening. "I've been waiting my whole life to be found," he said quietly. "Thank you for loving my son. Thank you for being there for him when I couldn't be." I also confronted my mother. It was the hardest conversation I had ever had, harder even than the conversation with my father on his porch. I sat across from her in her living room, the same living room where I had grown up, and I told her that I knew everything. I told her about the letter from the Innocence Project, about my visit to my father, about the 22 years he had spent in prison for a crime he didn't commit. I asked her why she had lied to me, why she had kept his letters from me, why she had tried to erase him from my life. She cried. She apologized. She told me that she had been young and scared and overwhelmed, that the police had convinced her of his guilt, that she had genuinely believed she was doing the right thing by protecting me from the truth. "I was wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I was wrong, and I have regretted it every single day for 26 years. But I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to tell you the truth without destroying everything. You should have told me anyway," I said. But my voice was softer now, the sharp edge of my anger dulled by exhaustion and compassion. "You should have let me decide for myself. Instead, you made the choice for me, and I spent my whole life believing a lie." "I know," she whispered. "I know. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Michael. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just hope that someday you'll understand." I didn't forgive her that day. Forgiveness, I was learning, was a process, not a moment. It took time and effort and a willingness to let go of the anger that had become so familiar it felt like a part of me. But I did understand her. I understood that she had been a victim too, a victim of a system that had failed our family in every possible way. She had been manipulated by the police, deceived by the prosecution, abandoned by a justice system that was supposed to protect the innocent. She had made terrible choices, but she had made them out of fear and desperation, not out of malice. And so, slowly, over the course of many months and many difficult conversations, I began to forgive her. Not because what she had done was acceptable, but because holding on to my anger was hurting me more than it was hurting her. I had spent 26 years being angry at a man who didn't deserve it. I didn't want to spend the next 26 years being angry at a woman who, despite everything, had loved me and raised me and done her best. The real criminal, the man who had actually committed the robbery and murder that my father was convicted of, was never caught. The DNA evidence that had exonerated my father belonged to someone else, someone whose genetic profile was not in any database, someone who was still out there somewhere. The case was technically still open, but the detectives I spoke to admitted, with a kind of weary resignation, that it was unlikely to ever be solved. The trail had gone cold decades ago, and the resources simply weren't there to pursue it. My father had made his peace with that. "I spent 22 years wanting justice," he told me one afternoon, as we sat on his porch watching the sun set over the quiet street. "I wanted the real killer to be caught. I wanted the prosecutors to admit they were wrong. I wanted someone, anyone, to be held accountable for what happened to me. But I realized, after I got out, that justice isn't something you can count on in this world. Sometimes the bad guys win. Sometimes the innocent suffer. And the only thing you can control is how you respond to it. And how have you responded to it? I asked. He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I decided to focus on what I have, not what I lost, he said finally. I lost 22 years. I lost my wife, my home, my career, my reputation. I lost the chance to watch my son grow up. Those are things I can never get back. But I gained something too. I gained a perspective that most people never get. I learned what really matters in life. And now I have a second chance. A chance to know my son. A chance to be a father, even if I'm starting 30 years late. That's more than I ever expected to have. That's more than I deserve. You deserve everything, I said, my voice fierce. You deserve the world. You were robbed of 22 years of your life, and no one has ever apologized to you, and no one has ever been held accountable. The least the universe can do is give you a few good years at the end. My father smiled, a small, sad smile that broke my heart. The universe doesn't owe me anything, he said. But you're here. That's enough. That's more than enough. I thought about my father's words a lot in the weeks and months that followed. The universe doesn't owe me anything. He was right, of course. The universe was indifferent to our suffering, blind to our struggles, deaf to our cries for justice. But that didn't mean we were powerless. We could choose how to respond to the hand we were dealt. We could choose to be bitter or grateful, angry or forgiving, trapped in the past or hopeful for the future. My father had chosen hope. After 22 years of unimaginable suffering, he had chosen hope. And if he could do that, then surely I could too. I asked my father to move closer to me, to leave the small town where he had been living and come to the city where I worked in Julia and I had built our life together. He resisted at first, reluctant to impose, afraid of being a burden. But I insisted, and eventually he agreed. I found him a small apartment a few blocks from my office, close enough that I could visit him every day if I wanted to. And I did visit him, almost every day, bringing him coffee and pastries in the morning, taking him to dinner in the evening, introducing him to the life he had been denied for so long. I took him to see the buildings I had designed, the skyscrapers and museums and office complexes that were my legacy. He walked through them with a kind of quiet awe, running his hands over the walls and the railings, marveling at the spaces I had created. You built all this, he said, his voice full of wonder. My son built all this. I got it from you, I said. You were a carpenter. You built things with your hands. I just do it on a bigger scale. He shook his head slowly. I built cabinets and furniture and cribs. You build things that will last for generations. You're more than I ever was, Michael. You're more than I ever could have been. Don't say that, I said, my voice rough with emotion. You're my father. Everything I am, everything I've achieved, it all started with you. You gave me life. You gave me your hands and your eyes and your stubborn determination. And you never gave up, even when the world gave you every reason to. If I'm strong, it's because I come from you. We stood there together in the lobby of the building I was most proud of, a concert hall with a soaring glass ceiling and acoustics that had been praised by musicians from all over the world. My father looked up at the ceiling, at the way the light poured through the glass and illuminated the space, and he smiled. It was a real smile, not the sad, hesitant smile I had seen on his porch that first morning, but a genuine, joyful smile. I'm proud of you, he said. I've always been proud of you. And I'm grateful, every single day, that I lived long enough to tell you that. The journey from that first letter to where we are now was not an easy one. There were difficult conversations, painful revelations, moments when the weight of the past threatened to crush us both. But there was also healing. There was forgiveness. There was the slow, steady process of learning how to be a family. My father and I had been robbed of 26 years together. We could never get those years back, but we could make the most of the years we had left. I still talk to my mother. Our relationship is complicated, marked by a betrayal that can never be fully undone. But she is my mother, and I love her, and I have chosen to forgive her. Not because she deserves it, but because I deserve to be free of the anger that was consuming me. She and my father have not spoken since his release. I don't know if they ever will. Some wounds, I have learned, are too deep for reconciliation. But they have both found a kind of peace, and that, in the end, is what matters. As for me, I have found something I never expected. A father. A real father. Not the ghost I had imagined. Not the villain I had been told about, but a man of flesh and blood and incredible resilience. A man who survived the unimaginable and came out the other side with his humanity intact. A man who taught me, by his example, that it is possible to endure the worst the world can throw at you and still choose love over hatred, hope over despair, forgiveness over bitterness. I was 29 years old when I learned that my father was not the man I thought he was. He was so much more.